Just for a moment, I want you to feel the beat of your own heart, that quiet, steady rhythm in the stillness. The woman in our story tonight can feel hers. It is a drumbeat of terror and of hope. She is standing where she is not allowed to be, in a silent room before the most powerful man in the world. She has no army, no weapon. She has only a secret, a plea, and a courage she did not know she possessed until this very second. Chapter 1. Esther's Hidden Roots. The dust of Susa tasted of exile. It settled on the lips of the market-goers, coated the leaves of the date palms, and filled the air with the grit of a kingdom that was not her own. For Esther, the orphaned daughter of Abihail, the very atmosphere of the Persian capital was a constant reminder of a heritage she had to bury. She moved through the crowded streets with a quiet grace that belied the tension coiled in her heart, a young woman whose outward beauty was matched only by the profound humility she carried within. Her world was a small sun-baked house on the edge of the Jewish quarter, a sanctuary built not of stone and mortar, but of the steadfast love of her cousin Mordecai. He had taken her as his own daughter when the shadow of death fell upon her parents, a tragedy spoken of in hushed tones that Esther could scarcely remember. Mordecai's love was the bedrock of her existence, a steady protective force that had shaped her into the woman she was becoming. In the cool of the evening, they would sit together, the scent of baking bread and simmering lentils weaving a comforting tapestry of domestic peace. He would tell her stories of their ancestors, of a promised land far to the west, and of a God who heard the cries of his people. These stories were her inheritance, more precious than any Persian silver and more dangerous. Mordecai's eyes, dark and perceptive, missed nothing. He saw the sidelong glances from Persian officials, the subtle shift in a merchant's demeanor when he detected a Hebrew accent. He understood the precariousness of their position, a small stream of captives trying to flow unnoticed through a mighty river of empire. His love for Esther was fierce, and it was this ferocity that birthed his most solemn warning. One evening, as the sky bled from orange to deep violet, he called her to him. The gravity in his voice stilled the air around them. He spoke not as a doting father, but as a leader of their people, his words measured and grave. He impressed upon her the vital necessity of secrecy. Her name, her lineage, the very faith that pulsed in her veins, all of it must remain hidden behind the gentle mask of her Persian demeanor. To be known as a Jewess in the court of King Ahasuerus was to wear a target, to invite suspicion and danger from those who saw their people as a foreign irritant, a people with strange customs and an unyielding God. Esther listened, the weight of his words settling deep within her soul. She understood that this concealment was not a betrayal of who she was, but an act of preservation. It was a shield forged from love to protect not just herself, but Mordecai and the fragile community they belonged to. She nodded her acceptance, a silent vow passing between them. Her beauty, which drew admiring glances in the marketplace, would now become her primary disguise. Her humility, a trait nurtured in a home of loss and grace, would keep her from drawing the wrong kind of attention. From that day forward, Esther carried a double life within her. On the surface, she was a lovely, unassuming young woman of Susa. But beneath that tranquil surface flowed the deep, hidden currents of a daughter of Israel. She learned to school her features, to let the name Hadassah the name that spoke of myrtle trees and her mother's love, fade into the quiet places of her heart. She became Esther, a name that suited the Persian tongue, while her true identity became her most guarded secret, a precious and perilous truth known only to her and the cousin who had become her father. The dust of Susa would not claim her soul, but for now it would have to conceal it. Chapter 2. A royal decree. The sun blazed over the royal citadel of Susa, glinting off marble colonnades and gilded rooftops, a spectacle of power meant to dazzle and intimidate. Within the sprawling palace complex, King Ahasuerus presided over an opulence so vast it seemed to defy the very passage of time. For 180 days, the nobility and satraps of his 127 provinces had witnessed the unending parade of his glory. The treasures of conquered nations, the armies of sculpted soldiers, the silks and spices that choked the air with perfume. This was not merely a feast, it was a performance of absolute dominion, a calculated display designed to burn the king's invincibility into the minds of every man who served him. The final 7 days were a crescendo of this spectacle, held in the enclosed garden courtyard of the palace. The air, thick with the scent of crushed roses and myrrh, hummed with the low murmur of 1,000 voices. White linen curtains, tethered with cords of fine purple linen to silver rings on marble pillars, fluttered in the hot breeze. Couches of gold and silver were arranged upon a mosaic pavement of porphyry, marble, mother of pearl, and precious stones. Royal wine, sourced from the kingdom's finest vineyards, flowed from golden goblets without restraint, a river of indulgence meant to drown all cares and inhibitions. Each guest drank according to his own desire, the king having decreed there would be no compulsion, only the overwhelming force of his generosity. Yet, amidst this calculated chaos of splendor, a single discordant note was struck. In the women's quarters, Queen Vashti hosted her own banquet, a separate but parallel celebration of royal stature. As the revelry in the king's garden reached a fever pitch, fueled by 7 days of unbroken merriment and wine, Ahasuerus conceived a final, crowning display of his power. He desired to present his queen before the assembled princes and people to showcase not just his wealth, but his most beautiful possession. He commanded his 7 chamberlains to summon Vashti, to have her appear before the drunken throng wearing the royal crown, so that all might behold her beauty. The command traveled through the palace's cool, shadowed halls, a ripple of royal will. But when it reached the queen, it met an immovable object. For reasons known only to her, perhaps pride, perhaps modesty, perhaps a profound and sudden weariness with being a spectacle, Vashti refused. Her denial was not a shouted rebellion, but a quiet, steadfast no that echoed with startling force in the cavernous rooms of the palace. The chamberlains returned with the message, and the king's merriment curdled into a cold, sobering rage. His fury was a physical presence, a storm cloud that silenced the music and stilled the goblets in mid-air. The humiliation was absolute, a public shaming before the most powerful men in his empire. In his anger, he consulted the sages of law and precedent who knew the times, men like Memucan and Karshena, who saw the queen's defiance not as a personal slight, but as a contagion. They warned the king that Vashti's actions would soon be known by all women, teaching them to look with contempt upon their own husbands. What she had done would inspire noble ladies throughout Persia and Media to do the same, unleashing endless disrespect and discord. Their counsel was swift and severe. They advised that a royal decree be issued, one that could never be revoked, declaring that Vashti was to come no more before King Ahasuerus, and that her royal position be given to another, one more worthy. The decree, written into the immutable laws of the Persians and the Medes, was to be proclaimed throughout the vast empire in every language of its people, establishing that every man should be ruler in his own house. The proposal, born from wounded pride and political calculation, pleased the king. Messengers were dispatched on swift horses to every province, carrying the news that Queen Vashti was deposed. As the echoes of the great feast faded and the palace began the laborious process of clearing away the physical remnants of its excess, a new, quieter energy took hold. The king's anger subsided into a brooding contemplation, and his servants, ever attentive to the shifting winds of power, saw an opportunity. They suggested a search be initiated throughout all the provinces for beautiful young virgins, who would be gathered to the citadel of Susa, into the care of Haggai, the king's eunuch and keeper of the women. From this assembled harem, a new queen would be chosen. The word went out, a royal decree that would sweep through the city and into the quiet home of a Jewish orphan, setting in motion a chain of events that would alter the destiny of an entire people. Chapter 3. The Gathering of Virgins. The royal decree arrived in Susa like a sudden desert storm, stirring the dust of ordinary lives into frantic motion. It swept through marketplaces and whispered along narrow streets, carrying the king's command into every household where beautiful young women dwelled. For Esther, the proclamation felt like a seismic shift in the very ground beneath her feet, a distant thunder that had suddenly broken directly overhead. The quiet life she had built with Mordecai, the careful balance of hidden identity and outward compliance, was about to be shattered. Royal officials moved through the city with methodical efficiency, their eyes cataloging and assessing. When they came to Mordecai's humble home, their gaze fell upon Esther, and there was no question. Her beauty was not merely of feature, but of presence, a gentle radiance that could not be concealed by simple garments or a modest demeanor. The command was given, not as a request, but as an unchangeable fact of imperial law. She was to be gathered with the others, taken to the king's palace to enter a competition she had never sought. In the moments before her departure, the air in their home was thick with unspoken fears. Mordecai's face, usually a mask of calm wisdom, was etched with a profound anxiety. He drew her close one last time, his hands firm on her shoulders as if he could physically imprint his guidance upon her. He repeated his most crucial warning, his voice a low, urgent murmur. Her secret was her shield. Her heritage must remain buried deeper than ever before. In the gilded cage of the palace, surrounded by ambition and intrigue, a single whispered word could mean destruction. She was to be Esther, the Persian maiden, pleasing and agreeable, letting no hint of Hadassah the Jewess ever surface. She nodded, her throat too tight for words, storing his counsel in the deepest part of her heart, like a precious, life-giving seed. The journey to the citadel was a blur of unfamiliar sights and sounds. She was ushered into a vast courtyard where a constellation of other young women had already been assembled. They stood in anxious clusters, a garden of human flowers plucked from every corner of the empire, tall Median girls with hair like polished jet, Egyptians with kohl-rimmed eyes, and fair-skinned daughters of Ionia. The air vibrated with a nervous energy, a mixture of terrified tears and ambitious whispers. Silks rustled, and the scent of 100 different perfumes clashed in the still air. Esther felt a wave of overwhelming exposure, a sparrow trapped among peacocks. She kept her eyes downcast, her posture humble, clinging to the memory of Mordecai's steadfast presence as her only anchor. Then came Haggai, the king's eunuch, the custodian of this feminine treasury. He moved through the gathering with a practiced, dispassionate eye, his gaze sweeping over the assembled beauty with the appraisal of a merchant evaluating precious gems. He was a man who had seen countless women come and go, their hopes rising and falling on the tide of the king's fleeting attention. His expression remained largely impassive until his eyes came to rest on Esther. Something in her stillness, in the quiet grace with which she held herself apart from the frantic posturing, caught his attention. Where others simpered or preened, she simply was. Her beauty was undeniable, a harmony of feature and form, but it was her demeanor that truly captivated him, a humility that seemed innate, not practiced. It was a rare commodity in this place of fierce competition. A flicker of approval crossed his usually inscrutable face. Haggai, whose favor could smooth the path to the throne, saw in Esther not just a candidate, but a potential protégé. He directed his attendants to see that she was given the best place in the harem, the choicest food, and the most attentive servants. It was a silent declaration of favor, a current that began to pull her forward on a path she had never chosen, deeper into the heart of the empire and farther from the only home she had ever known. Chapter 4. Preparation and Purification. The harem was a world of scented silences and whispered ambitions, a gilded labyrinth where time was measured not in days, but in beauty treatments. For Esther, the next 12 months unfolded in a strange, dreamlike sequence of anointings and ablutions, a ritual of transformation designed to erase the girl from the outer provinces and create a polished jewel fit for a king's gaze. Her days began and ended in the care of the palace attendants, a small army of silent women who moved with practiced efficiency, their hands as impersonal as the tools of a sculptor. She was introduced to the regimen of myrrh, a 6-month immersion in the rich, resinous oil that seeped into her skin until she carried its earthy, sacred fragrance with her like a second layer of flesh. The process was meticulous and unending. Each morning, her body was anointed until it gleamed, the oil massaged into her limbs by hands that never tired, the scent so potent it clung to the curtains of her chamber and flavored the very air she breathed. This was followed by another 6 months with spices and cosmetics, a more complex alchemy of beautification, jars of precious ointments, crushed pearls for luminescence, kohl to define the eyes, and henna to stain her palms and soles were all applied with ceremonial precision. Her skin was scrubbed with salts from the Dead Sea, her hair washed with lotus extract, until it fell in a cascade of perfumed silk. Through it all, Esther maintained a quiet composure that set her apart from the other women. The harem was a simmering pot of rivalries and alliances, of young women who schemed and boasted, their laughter often sharp with envy. They traded secrets like currency and measured each other's progress with sidelong calculating glances. Esther moved through this treacherous social landscape with a disarming humility. She offered no boasts, traded no gossip, and showed kindness even to those who viewed her with suspicion. She accepted the special favor of Haggai, who continued to provide her with 7 chosen maidservants and the best apartments, not with arrogant entitlement, but with a gracious gratitude that only deepened his regard for her. She listened more than she spoke, her calm presence a quiet antidote to the harem's pervasive anxiety, and in doing so, she disarmed potential adversaries and gathered a reservoir of unspoken goodwill. Yet, beneath this placid surface, a secret life thrived. In the deepest quiet of the night, when the palace was still and the only light came from the moon, filtering through her window, Esther would retreat into the fortress of her faith. She remembered Mordecai's teachings, the stories of Abraham and Sarah, of Moses and the Exodus. She recalled the prayers he had taught her, the silent internal dialogues with the God of her fathers. These moments of secret devotion were her true purification, a cleansing of the spirit that the myrrh and spices could never achieve. She would touch the simple hidden bracelet Mordecai had given her, a plain band of bronze, a tangible reminder of who she truly was and the promise she had made. In these solitary hours, she fortified her heart against the seductive pull of Persian luxury and the constant pressure to forget her past. As the months turned and her presentation to the king drew near, the other women grew more tense, their preparations more frantic. But Esther, having been schooled in a different kind of preparation, felt a strange and steadying peace settle over her. The oils had made her skin soft. The cosmetics had enhanced her features, but it was the inner resilience, born of faith and secrecy, that truly prepared her for what was to come. She was being polished for a king's court, but her spirit was being tempered for a purpose she could not yet see. Chapter 5. The King's Choice. The moment of presentation arrived like a verdict. After 12 months of perfumed preparation, Esther stood at the threshold of the king's inner court, her heart a frantic drum against the cage of her ribs. The heavy scent of myrrh still clung to her skin, a ghost of her long purification. But it was the weight of her secret that truly anchored her to the marble floor. Haggai had advised her to take nothing with her but what he provided, and so she came unadorned by ambition, a blank page upon which the king might write his desire. Her beauty, honed to perfection by months of meticulous care, was now a weapon she had never asked to wield, and the silence in the cavernous hall ahead felt like the pause before a battle. She stepped into the throne room, a space so vast its ceiling seemed to swallow sound. The air was cool, carrying the faint aroma of sandalwood and power. At the room's far end, elevated on a dais of carved ivory and gold, sat King Ahasuerus. He was a figure of imposing grandeur, draped in robes that shimmered with embedded jewels, his bearded face set in lines of accustomed authority. The crown of the empire rested heavy upon his brow, and his eyes, dark and assessing, held the weary gaze of a man who had been presented with every luxury his kingdom could offer. He had seen a procession of beautiful women, each more artfully presented than the last, their charms laid before him like courses at a feast. A certain boredom had begun to settle over the proceedings, a jaded expectation of more of the same. Then his gaze fell upon Esther. Something in her quiet entrance, The unassuming grace with which she moved across the vast expanse of floor cut through the royal ennui. Where others had simpered or strutted, she simply approached, her head slightly bowed in a gesture that spoke of respect, not fear. Her beauty was undeniable, a harmony of feature that needed no artifice. But it was the light in her eyes, a combination of deep humility and unspoken strength, that truly captivated him. It was a light he had not seen in all the days of his search. The chronicled boredom vanished from his expression, replaced by a keen, focused interest. He leaned forward, his jeweled fingers tightening on the arms of his throne, his entire being drawn to this young woman who carried herself not as a supplicant, but as a queen in waiting. He did not hesitate. The decision was as swift as it was absolute. Before the court officials could exchange their usual murmured commentaries, before the scribes could even ready their style, the king gestured. He called for the royal crown, the very one taken from Vashti, a circlet of gold so brilliant it seemed to capture all the light in the room. With a ceremony that felt both sudden and inevitable, he placed it upon Esther's head, declaring her his queen. The court erupted in a wave of obligatory applause and prostrations, the sound washing over Esther in a surreal cascade. The plain Jewish orphan from the outskirts of Susa was now the Queen of Persia and Media, her new title a golden chain that felt both impossibly light and terrifyingly heavy. A great banquet was immediately declared in honor of Esther, a feast to surpass even the one held for the nobles and officials. Wine flowed, musicians played, and the entire citadel rejoiced at the king's pleasure. But for Esther, seated at the king's right hand, the celebration was a distant hum. The weight of the crown was a physical pressure on her brow, a constant reminder of the invisible crown she already wore, the crown of her hidden identity. With every toast to her beauty and grace, she felt the secret of her heritage burn within her, a live ember in a palace of tinder. She smiled, she accepted the homage, she played the part of the delighted queen, but behind her eyes a fortress was being built. She had gained the world, but in doing so she had accepted a peril that could, at any moment, consume her and everything she loved. The king had made his choice, and in the quiet of her new opulent chambers, Esther began to understand the terrifying cost of being chosen. Chapter 6. Mordecai's Vigilance. The stone arch of the king's gate offered a sliver of shade, a narrow refuge from the hammering Susa sun. For Mordecai, this post was more than a minor court appointment. It was a listening post, a vantage point from which he could monitor the subtle currents of power that flowed through the empire. Each day he took his place among the other officials, his posture erect, his eyes missing nothing. The palace, with its glittering facade, was a beast of many whispers, and he had learned to decipher its hidden languages, the hurried step of a worried messenger, the averted gaze of a conspirator, the casual arrogance of the newly promoted. His vigilance was a habit born of necessity, a deep-seated instinct to protect the fragile secret that now resided in the heart of the royal apartments. Queen Esther. The air in the shadowed corridor was still and hot, carrying the distant sounds of the city, the clatter of carts, the cries of merchants, the rhythmic tramp of the royal guard changing shifts. On this particular afternoon, the routine was broken by the arrival of two of the king's own chamberlains, Bigthan and Teresh, who were tasked with guarding the threshold of the inner court. They moved with a casual familiarity, their armor glinting dully in the filtered light. But there was a tension in their shoulders that betrayed a purpose beyond their normal duties. They assumed their posts near the great cedar doors, their voices a low, confidential murmur, believing themselves unobserved in the gate's sprawling antechamber. Mordecai, positioned slightly apart, remained motionless. He was a statue of quiet observation, but his ears, sharpened by years of listening for danger, caught the drift of their hushed conversation. At first it was mere grumbling, the common complaints of men burdened by duty and slighted by perceived injustices. But the tone soon shifted, the whispers growing sharper, more venomous. The words king and anger were spat out like poison. Then, clearer and more terrifying, came the outlines of a plot, a plan to lay violent hands on King Ahasuerus, to exploit a moment of vulnerability, a specific watch when the guard would be lightest. They spoke of grievances and promises of reward from unnamed parties, their conversation a tapestry of treason woven in the palace's very shadow. A cold dread, sharper than any winter wind, seized Mordecai's heart. This was not mere gossip. It was a death sentence waiting to be enacted. The implications crashed over him in a single, horrifying wave. The assassination of the king would throw the empire into chaos, a vortex of civil war and bloodshed from which no one, especially a Jewish queen of secret lineage, would be safe. Esther's position, her very life, was inextricably tied to the king's favor. His death would render her utterly vulnerable, a prize to be claimed or discarded in the ensuing struggle for power. He did not hesitate. The risk of exposure was nothing against the certainty of catastrophe. Waiting until the cover of dusk, he moved with a purposeful calm that belied the frantic beating of his heart. He dispatched a trusted messenger, a man whose loyalty had been proven in quieter times, with a coded message for the queen. The words were careful, the details precise, a stark report of treachery that needed no embellishment. The message traveled through the palace's secret channels, from hand to trusted hand, until it was delivered to Esther in the seclusion of her chambers. Esther received the news with a stillness that mirrored her cousin's. The carefree young woman of the harem was gone, replaced by a queen who understood the weight of consequence. She felt the cold touch of fear, but beneath it lay a core of steel forged in secrecy and faith. She knew she had to act, and act with the authority of her new station. Choosing her moment with precision, she approached the king not as a supplicant, but as a partner in safeguarding his reign. She presented Mordecai's report as her own, a loyal wife's duty to her husband and king, carefully omitting the source to protect him. Her words were measured, her demeanor one of grave concern. The king's reaction was swift and terrible. An investigation was launched immediately, its methods silent and efficient. The evidence was found, the conspiracy confirmed. Bigthan and Teresh were seized, their protestations cut short. The justice of the Persian court was absolute and merciless. The two guards, who had whispered their treason in the shadow of the gate, were executed, their fate a stark warning to any who would contemplate betrayal. In the aftermath, as the palace returned to its ordered rhythm, a scribe was summoned. The incident was recorded in the royal chronicles, the book of daily events kept in the presence of the king. There, etched in permanent ink alongside accounts of battles and decrees, was a simple entry noting how Mordecai the Jew, sitting at the king's gate, had uncovered a plot against the king's life. The record was made, the act of loyalty formally acknowledged. No parade was held, no immediate reward was given, but the fact was now part of the immutable history of the empire. Mordecai returned to his post at the gate, his vigilance undimmed, the secret of his heritage and his connection to the queen still safely guarded. He had saved a king, and in doing so had secured a foothold of influence, a line in a ledger that would one day be read again, in a sleepless night, with the fate of his people hanging in the balance. Chapter 7. Haman's Ascent. A new sun rose over the Persian court, but its light fell upon a man whose ambition burned hotter than any celestial body. Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite, was a figure carved from pride and polished by a relentless drive for power. His ascent through the ranks of the king's advisers had been a master class in cunning and flattery, a careful cultivation of the king's favor that masked a soul of profound arrogance. He knew the language of loyalty, but his heart beat only for the rhythm of his own advancement. And on a day that began like any other, King Ahasuerus, in a gesture of sweeping royal favor, elevated Haman to a position higher than any other noble or official in the empire. The king's decree was proclaimed throughout the citadel, commanding that every knee should bow and every head should bend in obeisance to the newly exalted Haman. The announcement sent a ripple through the corridors of power, a visible shift in the political atmosphere. From the marble-paved throne room to the dustier corners of the outer courts, the command was obeyed with immediate and unquestioning uniformity. When Haman passed, a wave of prostration preceded him, a human tide of groveling respect. Courtiers in silks and soldiers in armor alike pressed their faces to the cool stone, the rustle of their submission a constant soundtrack to his progress. His broad chest swelled with a satisfaction so profound it was almost a physical presence around him. The rings on his fingers caught the light, the fine linen of his robes whispered of his status, and his eyes, dark and sharp, drank in the spectacle of his own glory. This was the pinnacle he had schemed for, the absolute acknowledgment of his superiority. He moved through the palace as if he owned its very shadows. The weight of the king's signet ring, now entrusted to him, a heavy and delicious promise of unlimited authority. But at the king's gate, where the currents of the empire flowed in and out, there was one man who remained standing. Mordecai, seated in his usual place, did not stir from his post. He did not bow his head, nor did he bend his knee. As the crowd around him sank into a posture of reverence, he remained a solitary pillar of stillness, his gaze fixed ahead, his posture one of quiet resolve. The refusal was not a loud protest, but a silent, steadfast declaration. It was rooted in the ancient laws of his people, a covenant that forbade such profound homage to any man, especially one descended from Agag, the ancient enemy of Israel. For Mordecai, to bow was to betray the God of his fathers, to erase the line that separated the children of promise from the worshippers of power. His conscience was a territory no royal decree could conquer. Day after day, this silent confrontation repeated itself. Haman's procession would arrive, the sea of courtiers would part and prostrate, and Mordecai would remain, a rock of defiance in the river of conformity. The other officials at the gate noticed, their whispers growing from curiosity to concern. They approached Mordecai, their voices a mixture of confusion and alarm. They pressed him, asking why he transgressed the king's command, warning him of the danger he courted. Mordecai's answer was simple and unshakable. He was a Jew. It was the only explanation he offered, a statement of identity that was both his shield and his potential death sentence. The officials, now fearful for their own safety if they were seen to tolerate such insolence, carried the news to Haman. They told him of Mordecai the Jew, who sat at the king's gate and refused to honor him. The words struck Haman like a physical blow. The sweet wine of his triumph turned to vinegar in his mouth. The endless stream of prostrations, which moments before had been a symphony to his ego, now felt hollow, the entire performance mocked by this one man's silent contempt. His pride, a vast and fragile edifice, cracked under the weight of the insult. The offense was not merely personal, it was existential. That a Jew, a member of a people he considered beneath notice, would dare to withhold the homage he received from princes was an unbearable poison. He saw in Mordecai's steadfastness not just an individual act of defiance, but a representation of an entire people's stubborn otherness, their refusal to be assimilated into the smooth machinery of the empire. A cold, calculating fury began to replace his initial rage. It was not enough to destroy Mordecai alone. Such a punishment would be a mere pruning of a single branch. Haman's wounded pride demanded a far greater vengeance, a solution that would eradicate the root of the problem. The insult, he decided, was not Mordecai's alone, but belonged to his entire race, their laws, their customs, their very existence as a separate people was an affront to his authority and the unity of the empire he now sought to dominate. In the shadowed privacy of his mind, a monstrous plan began to take shape. He would not be content until the stain of Mordecai's defiance and the people it represented was scrubbed from the face of the earth. The seed of a genocidal decree was planted in the fertile soil of Haman's wounded pride, and it began to grow with a vicious, relentless speed. Chapter 8. The decree of destruction, the poison of wounded pride once seeded in a man like Haman, festered with a virulence that could infect an empire. The daily sight of Mordecai's unwavering posture at the king's gate became a torment, a splinter in Haman's soul that festered with each passing hour. He could no longer enjoy the sweet wine of his promotion, for its taste was forever soured by the bitter gall of that one silent refusal. The adulation of the masses felt like a mockery, their prostrations meaningless, so long as one man remained standing. In the gilded solitude of his chambers, surrounded by the spoils of his position, Haman brooded. His vast pride, like a disturbed hornet's nest, buzzed with a single destructive purpose, vengeance. But a mere execution would be insufficient, a petty squashing of an insect. He desired an annihilation so complete it would erase the very memory of the offense. He bided his time, allowing his rage to cool into a cold, calculating malice. He gathered his household, his wife Zeresh, and his circle of advisers, and laid before them the grievance. They, mirrors of his own arrogance, fanned the flames. They spoke not of moderation, but of ultimate solutions. The problem, they agreed, was not Mordecai alone, but the stubborn peculiarity of his people, a nation scattered and separate, with laws different from all other peoples who did not keep the king's laws. It was this separateness that allowed for such defiance. Their counsel was a spark to tinder. To destroy Mordecai was to treat a symptom. To destroy his people was to cure the disease. Thus fortified, Haman sought an audience with the king. He entered the throne room not as a petitioner, but as a concerned statesman, his face a mask of grave duty. He knew the king's mind, his love for order, his suspicion of dissent, his reliance on his most trusted officials. Haman's words were chosen with the precision of a master manipulator. He did not speak of a personal insult or a single man's disobedience. Instead, he painted with a broad and terrifying brush. "There is a certain people," he began, his voice low and earnest, "scattered and dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom." He described them as a people whose laws were different, a people who did not obey the king's statutes. He twisted their distinctiveness into disloyalty, their faith into sedition. It was not good, he insisted with feigned concern for the crown, for the king to tolerate them. He proposed a final solution, wrapped in the language of royal security. Let a decree be written for their destruction. To sway the vacillating king, Haman added the lure of treasure. He offered to pay 10,000 talents of silver, a king's ransom, an almost unimaginable sum, into the royal treasury to facilitate the deed. It was a master stroke, framing genocide as both a necessary act of state and a profitable enterprise. He then presented the final chilling detail, the casting of the the lot, to determine the propitious day for the massacre. The lot was cast in his presence, and it fell on the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar. The date was set, nearly a year away, giving the decree the weight of an inevitable, preordained fate. King Ahasuerus, perhaps weary, perhaps disinterested in the complexities of a people he did not understand, and swayed by the trusted counsel of his highest official, gave his assent. The matter seemed to him a minor administrative affair, a removal of a troublesome element. With a gesture that was both casual and catastrophic, he removed the signet ring from his own finger and handed it to Haman. "The silver is given to you," he said, "the people also, to do with them as seems good to you." The authority of the empire was now vested in the hands of a man burning with genocidal hatred. The machinery of the Persian state, efficient and relentless, swung into action. The king's scribes were summoned on the 13th day of the first month, Nisan. They wrote as Haman dictated, drafting the decree in the name of King Ahasuerus. It was written in the script of every province and in the language of every people, from India to Ethiopia, so that all would understand the king's command. The edict was sealed with the king's own signet ring, making it an unchangeable law of the Medes and Persians. Couriers, mounted on the royal horses bred from the swiftest studs, were dispatched in haste, racing to every corner of the vast empire, carrying the scrolls of death. In Susa, the proclamation was first read aloud in the open square before the citadel. The words fell upon the crowded marketplace like a physical blow. To destroy, to kill, and to annihilate all Jews, young and old, women and children, in one day, the 13th day of the 12th month, Adar, and to plunder their goods. A stunned silence followed, broken by a single, sharp cry that quickly swelled into a wave of panic and grief. The decree was not a distant rumor. It was a death warrant, publicly posted and irrevocable. The king and Haman, the message declared, sat down to drink, the city of Susa thrown into confusion. But for the Jewish community, the confusion was a prelude to terror. The world, which had always been a place of careful navigation and hidden identity, had suddenly and officially declared them enemies, marked for extinction. The shadow of the 13th of Adar began to stretch across the empire, a year-long night, descending upon every Jewish heart. Chapter 9. Mourning in sackcloth. The news of the royal decree did not travel to Mordecai on the swift, official horses of the king's couriers. It came on the ragged, terrified breath of his own people. The words, first a whisper in the market, then a wail from the synagogue, finally reached him at his post by the king's gate like a contagion of despair. The official proclamation, read aloud in the city square, was merely the formal echo of a truth that was already curdling the blood of every Jew in Susa. The words, destroy, kill, annihilate, were not abstract legal terms. They were a death sentence for a nation, a meticulously planned extinction sealed with the king's own ring. And the date, the 13th of Adar, was a monstrous star fixed in the heavens, a year of condemned life granted before the executioner's axe fell. A sound tore from Mordecai's throat, a raw, guttural cry of anguish that was part lament and part fury. It was the sound of a world breaking. In that single shattering moment, the careful facade of the Persian official was annihilated. The man who had counseled secrecy, who had built a life on quiet vigilance and hidden identity, was gone. What remained was the Jew, the descendant of exiles, facing the promised end of his line. He rose from his seat, his movements jerky and uncontrolled. He ripped his tunic, the sound of tearing linen a sharp protest in the still air. The fine garment, a symbol of his minor station, was now a testament to his grief. He cast it aside and reached for the only fabric that could now contain his sorrow, sackcloth, the coarse, prickly haircloth of mourners and penitents. He did not retreat to the privacy of his home. His grief was too vast, too public. He walked out into the heart of the city, into the open square before the king's gate, and let the ashes from a nearby hearth be poured over his head. The gray powder settled into his hair, his beard, coating his skin in a film of desolation. The sackcloth chafed against his skin, a constant physical reminder of the coming desolation. He was a living monument to catastrophe, a solitary figure of profound grief set against the unyielding marble of the palace. He did not speak, but his entire being was a scream. He lifted his face to the heavens, his eyes blind to the stares of the passing Persians, his voice joining a rising chorus of lament that was beginning to emanate from the Jewish quarter, a great and bitter cry that seemed to darken the very sun. Over Susa, the news, carried on this tide of mourning, seeped through the palace walls. It reached the inner courtyards and the women's quarters, where Esther sat in isolated splendor. Her maidservants, their faces pale with fear, came to her with the report of Mordecai in the square, clothed in sackcloth and ashes. A cold dread, colder than any she had ever known, gripped Esther's heart. The world of perfumed silks and golden goblets seemed to shrink, revealing itself as the fragile illusion it had always been. The danger she had always feared had not come as a discovery of her secret, but as a scythe meant to cut down every person who shared it. She acted quickly, her mind racing. She sent fresh garments out to Mordecai, a queen's command to replace the sackcloth, a desperate attempt to restore the order that had just been obliterated. But Mordecai refused them. The rejection of the robes was more powerful than any message he could have sent. It was a declaration that no royal favor, no position, no silken disguise could mitigate this horror. The time for hidden identities was over. Understanding the finality of his refusal, Esther knew she needed to hear the truth directly from him. She dispatched Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs assigned to her, a man whose discretion she trusted, to go to Mordecai and learn the precise reason for this overwhelming display of grief. Hathach went out into the square, navigating the growing crowd of mourners until he found the ashen, sackcloth-clad figure of Mordecai. The trusted courtier, accustomed to the polished language of the palace, stood before the raw, unvarnished truth of a people condemned. Mordecai did not spare him the details. He told him everything, the exact words of Haman's decree, the promise of plunder that had been issued to the people, the specific, terrible sum of silver Haman had pledged to pay into the royal treasury for their destruction. He gave Hathach a copy of the written decree that had been issued in Susa, the ink on the parchment still fresh, the king's seal a brutal stamp of finality. Then, his voice dropping to a low, urgent intensity, Mordecai gave Hathach a charge for Esther. It was not a request from a cousin to a cousin. It was a summons from a leader of Israel to the queen of Persia. He commanded her to go in to the king, to plead with him, to implore him for the life of her people. The words were a gauntlet thrown at her feet. He was calling her out of the safety of her royal chambers and into the lethal arena of the throne room. He was tearing away the last vestiges of her disguise, not to expose her, but to arm her. The secret she had guarded so fiercely was no longer just her burden. It was now her only weapon. The girl he had raised to be invisible was now being commanded to stand in the one place where visibility could mean instant death for the sake of every life that shared her hidden blood. Chapter 10. Esther's Dilemma. The words of Mordecai's message hung in the perfumed air of Esther's chambers like a shroud. The scroll Hathach had delivered felt cold and heavy in her hands, its official script detailing the annihilation of her people with a bureaucratic calm that was more terrifying than any scream. The plea from her cousin was not a suggestion. It was a command, a stark imperative that shattered the fragile peace of her royal existence. The queen's apartments, with their hanging gardens of embroidered silks and their floors of polished porphyry, suddenly felt like a gilded trap. The very air, scented with cinnamon and nard, seemed to thicken, becoming difficult to breathe. A cold, sharp fear, more visceral than any she had ever known, pierced through her. It was not the abstract fear of discovery she had lived with for years, but the immediate, physical terror of the law. The decree Mordecai urged her to challenge was not just Haman's. It was the king's, sealed with his own ring and bound by the unchangeable statutes of the Medes and Persians. And the law that governed her own access to the king was just as immutable. For 30 days, she realized with a sinking heart, the king had not summoned her. The memory of the golden scepter, the symbol of royal grace that alone could stay an instant death for an unsummoned approach, flashed in her mind. To walk into the throne room unbidden was to gamble her life on a monarch's whim, on whether the flicker of favor in his eyes would outweigh the cold fury for a broken protocol. It was not a request to risk rejection. It was a command to risk execution. She sent a swift, desperate reply back to Mordecai, carried by the faithful Hathach. Her words were not those of a queen, but of a frightened woman, outlining the brutal reality he, in his grief, seemed to have forgotten. She detailed the law of the palace, known to all, that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned, there is but one law, that they be put to death, except the king holds out the golden scepter so that they may live. And I, she imparted, have not been summoned to come into the king these 30 days. The statement was a confession of her own powerlessness, a stark admission that her crown was a decoration, not a shield, against the foundational laws of the empire she supposedly ruled. As the messenger departed, a profound stillness fell over Esther. The frantic pulse of fear began to recede, replaced by a deep, churning turmoil. She moved to a latticed window overlooking the private palace gardens, the manicured order of the cypress trees and jasmine bushes a stark contrast to the chaos within her. Her gaze turned inward, traveling back through the strange winding path that had led her to this moment. The humble Jewish home, the terrifying summons to the palace, the year of anointing, the dizzying moment the crown was placed upon her head. It had all felt like a series of accidents, a current of fate she had simply been swept along. She had accepted it as her lot, a strange and perilous life to be navigated with secrecy and grace. But now, Mordecai's plea forced a new and terrifying lens over her past. Had it all been an accident? The thought was as vertiginous as the view from a high tower. What if her beauty, her favor with Haggai, the king's captivated gaze, what if these were not random strokes of fortune, but the careful, deliberate placements of a divine hand? What if her entire life, from the moment of her parents' death to this very second standing in a queen's robes, had been a preparation for this single, awful crossroads? The notion was both terrifying and electrifying. It meant her life was not her own to cautiously preserve, but a tool to be used for a purpose far greater than her own safety. The crown on her brow felt different now, not just a weight, but a responsibility. The secrecy she had maintained to protect herself now felt like a disguise that had been necessary to get her into this specific position of potential influence for such a time as this. The unspoken phrase echoed in the silent chamber, a question and an answer wrapped in one. Her dilemma was no longer merely a choice between action and inaction. It was a choice between living for herself or accepting that she might have been placed in the palace to die for her people. Chapter 11. A Call to Courage. The reply that returned from Mordecai was not the gentle reassurance of a cousin, nor the softened plea of a grieving elder. It was a prophet's cry, a trumpet blast of truth that shattered the last vestiges of Esther's hesitation. Hathach delivered the message, his face ashen, the words seeming to burn the very air as he repeated them. Mordecai's response was a stark reframing of reality, a brutal dismantling of the illusion of safety she had so carefully constructed. He commanded her not to think that in the king's palace, surrounded by Persian silks and guarded by foreign soldiers, she would escape any more than all the other Jews. The decree of destruction did not recognize the boundaries of the harem or the sanctity of a crown. The scythe that was coming for her people would not pause at the queen's chambers. Her royal disguise, he implied, was the thinnest of veils, and the wind of Haman's hatred would tear it away. Then came the words that would echo through the ages, the challenge that would define her forever. For if you remain silent at this time, the message declared, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. It was a statement of unshakable theological certainty, a declaration that the survival of their people was guaranteed by a covenant older than Persia itself. But her personal survival was not. Her inaction would not thwart the purposes of God, but it would irrevocably sever her from them. Her silence would be a self-inflicted death sentence, a choice to perish with the condemned rather than to stand as their potential deliverer. And who knows, the message concluded, the relentless logic giving way to a glimmer of terrifying grace. But that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this? The question hung in the room, a divine summons that left no room for further debate. It was as if a door she had never seen before had been flung open, revealing the true architecture of her life. Every moment, the loss, the secrecy, the favor, the crown, clicked into place with a terrible, perfect clarity. The path of caution she had been contemplating was now exposed as the path of certain doom, both for her soul and her body. The path of courage, though it led directly into the shadow of the golden scepter and the king's unpredictable wrath, was the only path that held any promise of life. A profound change settled over Esther. The frantic fear did not vanish, but it was met and mastered by a rising tide of resolve. The indecision that had paralyzed her crystallized into a single, unwavering purpose. The queen, who had been fashioned by Persian perfumes and royal decrees, receded, and in her place stood Hadassah, the daughter of Israel, claiming her moment. She sent a final message to Mordecai, her words now carrying the ring of command, the authority of a decision made. Her instructions were swift and precise. She commanded him to assemble all the Jews who could be found in Susa. They were to fast for her. For 3 days and 3 nights they were to take no food and no water. This was not a fast of mourning, but a fast of warfare, a spiritual siege laid against the gates of heaven, pleading for divine favor where human power had failed. She and her maids would do the same. The physical weakness of hunger would become their strength, a tangible expression of their complete dependence on a power greater than any king. This communal act of desperation and faith would be the foundation upon which she would build her impossible courage. The time for hidden prayers in the night was over. Now, an entire community would join their queen in a public, collective cry for mercy. When the 3 days of fasting were complete, she would go to the king. She would break the law of the palace, and she would do what was not done. And if I perish, her message ended, the words simple and stark, I perish. It was not a statement of despair, but the ultimate declaration of faith. She was stepping off the cliff of her own security, her fate no longer in her hands, but entrusted to the God of her fathers and the purpose for which she had been born. Chapter 12. The Unsummoned Approach. The 3 days of fasting descended upon the palace like a collective held breath, a silence more profound than any Esther had ever known. Within the queen's opulent chambers, the usual rhythms of life ceased. The tempting platters of fruit and spiced meats were removed. The golden goblets of wine remained untouched. The air, stripped of the scent of food, grew thin and solemn. Esther and her maidservants moved through the rooms like shades, their faces pale with hunger and their steps softened by a shared sacred purpose. The physical ache in her stomach was a constant companion, a gnawing reminder of the spiritual battle being waged not just within these walls, but throughout the city where her people were on their knees, their empty bellies a unified plea for divine intervention. Each hour that passed was a slow drip of water on stone, wearing away her fear and carving out a reservoir of desperate courage. On the morning of the third day, a strange and steady calm settled over her. The turmoil was gone, replaced by a fatalistic clarity. The words, "If I perish, I perish," had ceased to be a lament and had become her creed. She rose from her knees, her body light from lack of sustenance, but her spirit feeling impossibly heavy, weighted with the destiny of thousands. It was time to shed the garments of a penitent and clothe herself in the armor of a queen. She summoned her attendants, and the silent chamber erupted into a flurry of purposeful activity. They brought forth her royal robes, garments she had not worn since the celebratory banquet following her coronation. The fabrics, heavy with symbolism and power, were laid out before her. There was a tunic of the finest white linen, woven with threads of silver that caught the faint light. Over this went a sleeved robe of deep blue, the color of the night sky, embroidered with golden pomegranates and lilies, the symbols of life and royalty. A girdle of purple and scarlet, the colors of imperial authority, was fastened around her waist. Finally, they brought the crown itself, the heavy circlet of gold that was both her privilege and her prison. As they placed it upon her head, its familiar weight felt different, no longer a burden to be borne, but a weapon to be wielded. She stood before her polished bronze mirror, and the woman who looked back was a paradox, a queen in her full regalia, preparing to perform the most abject act of supplication. Her beauty, heightened by the sharp planes of her fasting and the brilliant contrast of the jewels, was a calculated risk. She would not approach as a frightened beggar, but as the king's own wife, in all her appointed glory, forcing him to see the value of what his own law demanded he destroy. With her physical preparation complete, she turned inward one last time. She stood alone by the window, the bustling city of Susa spread out below, unaware of the drama unfolding in the heart of its power. She thought of Mordecai, his ashen face etched with a faith that now had to be her own. She thought of the countless families in the Jewish quarter, their lives hanging on the thread of her next actions. She poured every ounce of her being, every memory, every hope, every whispered prayer from the last 3 days into a single, silent plea. It was not a request for her life, but for the words to speak, for the favor to find a crack in the wall of Persian law, for the courage to stand in the fire of the king's gaze and not be consumed. Then she moved. She walked from her chambers into the corridor, her maids falling into a silent procession behind her. The journey through the palace's interconnected halls and courtyards was a walk through a landscape of mounting tension. Courtiers and guards, seeing the queen in her full state robes moving with a purposeful stride, parted before her, their faces a mixture of curiosity and confusion. The air grew cooler as she neared the heart of the citadel, the marble walls seeming to press in, amplifying the thunderous beating of her own heart. The sound of her own footsteps on the polished stone was the only drum roll for her approach. She reached the final antechamber, a vast pillared hall that served as the buffer to the throne room itself. The great double doors of carved cedar, inlaid with ivory and gold, stood closed before her. a formidable barrier between the world of procedure and the seat of absolute power. Through the cracks around the doors, she could see the brilliant light of the inner court and hear the low murmur of officials. Taking a final shuddering breath that felt like the first and last of her life, she pushed the doors open and stepped across the threshold. The throne room was a cavern of light and power, the morning sun streaming through high windows to ignite the gold and jewels that adorned every surface. At the far end, upon a raised dais, sat King Ahasuerus on his throne of ivory and gold, robed in splendor, the royal scepter held loosely in his hand. His ministers and advisers stood in ranked silence around him. The moment she entered, every eye turned toward her. The murmur of conversation died instantly, replaced by a silence so profound she could hear the rustle of her own robes. It was the silence of shock, of breached protocol, of imminent death. She stood frozen just inside the doorway, her magnificent robes suddenly feeling like a shroud. Her body braced for the shouted command of the guards, for the cold touch of steel. The king looked up. His gaze, which had been resting on some state document, lifted and found her. For a heart-stopping moment, his expression was one of pure, uncomprehending surprise. Then it shifted. He saw the woman he had chosen from all others, standing in the full glory he had bestowed upon her, violating his most sacred law. He saw the paleness of her face, the desperate courage in her eyes that her royal bearing could not entirely conceal. And in that moment, something in the king's heart moved. Perhaps it was memory, the ghost of the captivating girl he had crowned. Perhaps it was a flicker of the gratitude he owed the cousin who had saved his life. Or perhaps it was a grace that operated beyond all human understanding. His face did not darken with anger, but softened with what looked like wonder. Slowly, deliberately, he extended the golden scepter in his hand toward her. The rigid rod of judgment became an instrument of mercy, a bridge across the impassable chasm of the law. The air rushed back into Esther's lungs. She stepped forward, her knees trembling, and reached out, touching the top of the scepter. The gesture was one of submission and acceptance. She had not perished. She had passed through the first fire, and she was alive. The touch of the golden scepter was not merely a pardon. It was an infusion of life, a current of grace that steadied Esther's trembling limbs and calmed the frantic drumming in her chest. The rigid formality of the throne room seemed to soften at its edges, the hostile silence melting into a palpable, waiting stillness. King Ahasuerus's gaze remained fixed upon her, his expression a complex tapestry of curiosity, concern, and a dawning admiration for the sheer audacity of her entrance. He saw not just a queen who had broken protocol, but a woman whose desperate courage had carved a new path through the immutable laws of his court. The extended scepter was an unspoken question, an invitation to voice the plea that had driven her to risk everything. Esther moved forward, her steps measured and graceful, despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. She approached the dais, her head bowed not in fear, but in a show of respect that now felt earned rather than obligatory. When she lifted her eyes to meet his, she saw not the wrath of a transgressed monarch, but the keen interest of a man confronted by mystery. His voice, when he spoke, was surprisingly gentle, cutting through the tense silence of the court. He asked her what her petition was, assuring her that it would be granted. even to the half of his kingdom. The grand proverbial offer was a standard royal courtesy, but the intensity in his eyes suggested he meant it as something more. He understood that no woman would court death for a triviality. In that suspended moment, with the full attention of the king and his court upon her, Esther's mind, honed by 3 days of fasting and prayer, worked with a preternatural clarity. The most direct path was not always the safest. To unveil her identity and accuse his most trusted advisor of genocide here, in this public forum, was a gamble of incalculable risk. Haman's influence was vast, his webs of loyalty intricately woven through the court. A public denunciation could backfire, turning the king's favor into defensive pride. She needed a more strategic stage, a controlled environment where the king's heart could be softened and Haman's arrogance could be turned against him. She needed to draw them both into her orbit, to create a moment of intimacy where the truth could land with the force of a personal betrayal. And so she did not speak of decrees or her people. Instead, she offered an invitation. Her voice, though soft, carried through the silent hall with a queenly composure. She asked that the king and Haman come that very day to a banquet she had prepared in the king's honor. It was a simple, gracious request, the act of a devoted wife wishing to celebrate her husband. The king, visibly pleased by this turn of events, immediately agreed. He commanded his attendants to summon Haman quickly, so that they might do as Esther had said. The swiftness of his assent was a further balm to her frayed nerves. She still held his favor. The summons found Haman in his own chambers, likely already preening with self-importance. To be called urgently to the king was a common occurrence, but to then be informed that he was to accompany the king to a private banquet with the queen was an unprecedented honor. A surge of pure, unadulterated pride swelled within him. As he hastened to join the royal couple, his mind raced with self-congratulation. He, Haman the Agagite, was the only official in the entire vast empire deemed worthy to share such an intimate moment with his sovereign and the beautiful queen. This was more than favor, it was a signal, a clear indication of his unparalleled standing. The bitter memory of Mordecai's defiance at the gate seemed a small, distant irritant, a gnat buzzing at the edges of his magnificent triumph. He walked through the palace corridors as if on a cloud, his heart pounding not with anxiety, but with the exhilarating rhythm of his own ascent. The banquet itself was a study in tense contrasts. Esther's chambers had been transformed. Low tables were laden with delicacies, roasted lamb with cumin, figs stewed in honey, delicate pastries filled with dates and nuts. The air was sweet with the scent of saffron and rosewater. Esther presided over the meal with impeccable grace, serving the king with her own hands, her every movement a performance of serene devotion. The king, relaxed and expansive from the fine wine and the pleasing company, was clearly delighted. Haman, seated in the place of honor, basked in the reflected glory, his laughter a little too loud, his gestures a little too broad. He drank in the king's easy conversation and the queen's attentive smiles, seeing only the confirmation of his own greatness. He was blind to the calculation behind Esther's eyes, deaf to the silent prayers that underpinned her every gracious word. He saw a celebration of his power, while Esther was quietly laying the groundwork for its destruction. When the king, his heart warmed by wine and the pleasing atmosphere, turned to Esther and once again pressed her for her true request, repeating his extravagant promise. She demurred once more. She asked instead that they both return the next day for another banquet. Then, she promised, she would reveal her petition. It was a masterstroke of suspense, a hook set deep in the king's curiosity and Haman's pride. The king agreed readily, the mystery only increasing his desire to please her. As the two most powerful men in Persia departed, one bemused and intrigued, the other puffed up with vain glory, Esther was left alone in the aftermath of the feast. The silence that descended was different from the fearful stillness of the morning. It was a quiet humming with purpose. She retreated to her private quarters, the scent of the banquet still clinging to the air, and knelt once more. This time, her prayers were not cries of desperation, but affirmations of thanks and petitions for continued strength. The first, most lethal hurdle had been cleared. The king's heart was open to her. She had successfully lured her enemy into a false sense of security, making him a guest at his own impending downfall. A steady, ferocious confidence, forged in the fires of faith and fasting, now burned within her. She had looked into the lion's mouth and not been devoured. Now she had to teach it to turn on another. Chapter 13. The first banquet. The air in Esther's private banquet hall was thick with unspoken tension, a stark contrast to the delicate aromas of roasted quail, saffron-infused rice, and honeyed wine that wafted from the low tables. Golden platters gleamed in the soft light of hanging lamps, and the walls, draped in rich tapestries depicting royal hunts, seemed to lean in, listening. King Ahasuerus reclined on a cushion of embroidered silk, his expression one of relaxed indulgence, his earlier surprise at Esther's boldness having melted into a pleased curiosity. Beside him, Haman occupied the place of honor, his large frame swelling with visible pride, his eyes glittering with the thrill of his exclusive proximity to power. He savored each morsel, each sip of wine, as if it were a personal tribute to his greatness, the singular honor of this invitation a sweet balm to his perpetually hungry ego. Esther moved between them with a preternatural calm, a study in graceful composure. Dressed in robes of deep blue and silver, the royal crown a steady weight upon her brow, she was the perfect hostess. Her hands, steady and sure, poured the wine, her voice a soft murmur as she directed the silent servants. She offered the king the choicest cuts of meat, the sweetest fruits, her attentiveness, a performance of wifely devotion that perfectly masked the storm of purpose raging within her. Every smile she bestowed upon Haman was a masterful act of deception, a hook baited with flattery and set deep in the waters of his vanity. He saw only a queen acknowledging his importance, utterly blind to the hunter concealed beneath the silks. The king, his senses dulled by fine wine and the pleasing atmosphere, watched her with growing admiration. The mystery of her unsummoned approach had only deepened her allure. He saw her beauty, yes, but also a new and compelling strength in her demeanor, a quiet authority that intrigued him. As the meal drew to a close, with the last of the date pastries cleared away and the wine taking its warm, drowsy effect, he turned to her, his gaze soft and expectant. He had not forgotten his promise. Leaning forward, his voice warm with affection and royal assurance, he pressed her once more. He asked for her petition, reiterating his vow that it would be granted even up to half his kingdom. The grand proverbial offer hung in the scented air, a key offered to unlock any door in his empire. This was the moment. The suspense she had carefully cultivated tightened like a drawn bowstring. Every instinct, every prayer, every fasted hour screamed for her to reveal the terrible truth, to fall at his feet and expose the viper he had welcomed to his table. She could name her people, name Haman's plot, and throw herself on the king's mercy. But a deeper wisdom held her tongue. She saw Haman's smug satisfaction, the unshakable confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable. A public accusation here, in this semi-private yet politically charged space, could still go awry. Haman was a master of words, a manipulator of the highest order. He could twist her revelation, defend himself, and potentially turn the king's favor. She needed him more deeply ensnared, his arrogance so inflated that the fall would be absolute. And so, with a humility that was both genuine and strategically perfect, she did not ask for the half of his kingdom. Instead, she offered another invitation. Her voice was clear and steady, carrying to both men. She asked that the king and Haman would grant her the pleasure of their company once more. She invited them to return the following day for a second banquet, which she would also prepare. Then she promised she would reveal her request. It was a breathtaking act of narrative control, a postponement that heightened the drama and secured their return. She was writing the script of her own drama, casting Haman as the honored guest, marching willingly to his own execution. The king, his curiosity now thoroughly piqued, agreed without hesitation. The delay only made him more eager to uncover the secret that had driven his queen to such lengths. Haman's chest swelled even further. A second, exclusive banquet? It was an honor upon an honor, a confirmation of his status so resounding it was almost dizzying. He saw not a trap, but a coronation of his influence. He left the queen's chambers that evening, walking on air, his head filled with visions of his own limitless future, the king's promise of anything echoing like a sweet symphony in his ears. He was blind to the cliff's edge he was approaching, his pride a thick veil over his perception. Esther watched them go, the ghost of a smile touching her lips. The first move was complete. She had secured their return and stoked the king's interest to a fever pitch. The stage was now set for the final, devastating act. Chapter 14. Haman's Boastful Pride. The sweet wine of the queen's banquet still warmed Haman's veins as he strode from the palace, a man clothed in the intoxicating garments of his own triumph. The evening air of Susa felt different in his lungs, lighter, sweeter, as if the very city were breathing in time with his exalted mood. He had dined alone with the king and queen, an honor no other soul in the vast empire could claim. The memory played behind his eyes like a cherished dream. Esther's gracious smiles, the king's easy conversation, the unspoken promise of a favor yet to be named. He walked through the torch-lit streets, not as a servant of the crown, but as its equal, his chest puffed out, his steps long and confident. The world was a polished apple resting in the palm of his hand, and he was about to take the first delicious bite. But as he passed through the king's gate, the familiar archway that marked the transition from royal sanctum to public square, his triumphant reverie was shattered by a sight that was like a splash of sewage on his silken robes. There, seated in his usual place, was Mordecai. The Jew had not moved. He did not rise. He did not bow. He did not even seem to register Haman's glorious passage. He simply sat, a statue of quiet defiance, his gaze fixed on some middle distance, his very stillness a louder insult than any shouted curse. The euphoria that had buoyed Haman evaporated, replaced by a fury so hot and sudden it stole his breath. The honor of the banquet, the king's favor, the queen's attention, all of it was rendered meaningless, mocked by this one man's obstinate refusal to acknowledge his supremacy. The splinter of Mordecai's disrespect, which had festered for so long, now felt like a dagger plunged into his heart. He stormed the rest of the way to his opulent home, the pleasant evening now poisoned. He burst through his doors, his face a thundercloud, and his wife Zeresh, and his circle of sycophantic advisers gathered around him, their expressions shifting from welcome to wary concern. They had expected to hear tales of royal favor. They saw instead a man consumed by a rage they knew all too well. Haman could not contain himself. He began to speak, his voice trembling with a violent passion. He recounted his riches, the multitude of his sons, every promotion and honor the king had heaped upon him. He painted a vivid picture of the evening's glory, the exclusive banquet, the queen's graciousness, the king's repeated promise to grant any request. He laid out the tapestry of his life, a masterpiece of success and power. Then, his voice dropping to a guttural snarl, he pointed to the single, ugly tear in the fabric. "Yet all this avails me nothing," he spat, "so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate." The confession was a window into the bottomless pit of his pride. All the treasures of the empire, all the accolades, all the power were worthless dust, so long as one man withheld the homage he believed was his divine right. The insult was no longer a personal grievance. It was a cosmological imbalance that only a drastic, final act could correct. His wife and advisers, whose own fortunes were tied to his, saw the depth of his torment and offered a solution as swift as it was brutal. They did not counsel patience or political maneuvering. Instead, they fed the beast of his wrath. "Let a gallows be made," they urged, "a towering structure of wood, 50 cubits high. Let him speak to the king in the morning," they advised, "and secure permission to hang Mordecai upon it. Then," they promised, "he could go joyfully with the king to the banquet." The thought was a balm to his wounded spirit. The image of Mordecai's body swinging from a grotesquely high pole, a public spectacle of his own power, filled him with a dark, anticipatory pleasure. It was the perfect, final solution. The physical destruction of the man would be the symbolic destruction of the defiance he represented. The command was given immediately. Haman's household erupted into activity, not of celebration, but of grim construction. Through the night, in the flickering light of oil lamps, the gallows began to take shape in his courtyard. The sound of hammers striking wood was a brutal percussion to Haman's thoughts. He supervised the work, his eyes gleaming with a feverish light, picturing the scene to come. He boasted to his family as the structure rose, its shadow stretching like a long black finger across his property. He spoke of his influence, of how the king denied him nothing, of how this final act would cement his absolute authority. He was not just building a means of execution, he was building a monument to his own pride, a towering edifice that he believed would finally cast a shadow large enough to eclipse the stubborn, silent Jew at the gate. As the first hints of dawn tinged the sky, the gallows stood complete, a stark and ugly silhouette against the paling stars, a testament to the fact that no amount of royal favor could fill the void in a heart consumed by hatred. Chapter 15. A sleepless night. The silence of the royal bedchamber was a heavy, suffocating blanket, thick with the scent of sandalwood and the lingering ghosts of the day's intrigues. King Ahasuerus lay upon his couch of spun gold and purple linen, his body weary, but his mind a churning, restless sea. The opulent banquet in Esther's chambers, the mystery of her unspoken request, the flattering presence of Haman, it should have been a recipe for peaceful slumber. Instead, a strange agitation held sleep at bay. The memory of Esther's face, so beautiful, yet shadowed by a gravity he could not decipher, played behind his closed eyelids. The king, accustomed to command and clarity, found himself adrift in a current of unspoken tensions, his own curiosity a hook in his soul that would not let him rest. He tossed upon his cushions, the silken sheets tangling around his legs. The more he sought the oblivion of sleep, the more vividly his mind replayed the evening. Esther's graceful deferral, her promise of a revelation on the morrow, had the effect of a locked casket whose key was just out of reach. What could be so urgent that it drove her to risk her life, yet so delicate that it required the staged intimacy of two banquets? His thoughts turned to Haman, the beneficiary of this strange drama. The man's preening satisfaction had been palpable, his laughter a little too ready, his pride a visible aura in the lamplight. A faint, undefined unease began to prickle at the king's consciousness, a sense that the pieces of his court were not fitting together as neatly as they should. Frustrated, he threw off the covers and rose from his bed. The cool marble of the floor was a shock to his bare feet. He paced the length of his vast chamber, the moon casting his long, restless shadow against the tapestried walls. He needed a diversion, something to quiet the clamor in his mind. He summoned a servant from the antechamber, his command crisp in the nocturnal hush. He called for the Book of Records, the chronicles of his reign, to be brought and read to him. There was a dull administrative comfort in the recitation of past events, the dry accounting of decrees and battles, of tribute received and provinces pacified. It was the history of his own power, a lullaby of control that had often soothed him before. The servant returned swiftly, carrying the heavy scrolls. A scribe was summoned, and by the flickering light of a single oil lamp, the reading began. The scribe's voice was a monotone drone, listing the minutiae of the empire. The king listened, his gaze fixed on the dancing shadows on the ceiling, only half attending. He heard of satraps appointed, of grain shipments from Egypt, of a minor rebellion quelled in the eastern provinces. The words washed over him, a river of forgotten details. Then the scribe's tone did not change, but the words he read suddenly snagged the king's wandering attention. The account was of a plot, years past, by two of the king's own chamberlains, Bigthan and Teresh, who had conspired to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. The memory, vague and half-formed, stirred in the king's mind. He remembered the tension, the swift investigation, the execution of the traitors. But the next words, read aloud in the same flat official tone, struck him with the force of a physical blow. The record stated that the discovery of the plot, the act that had saved the king's life, had been made by Mordecai the Jew, who sat at the king's gate. The name echoed in the silent room. Oh, Mordecai. It was not entirely unfamiliar. It was the name of the stubborn official who refused to bow to Haman, a minor irritant he had heard mentioned in passing. But here, in the immutable script of the royal chronicles, was a testament to the man's profound loyalty. A cold clarity cut through the king's drowsy agitation. He sat up abruptly, causing the scribe to falter. "What honor or dignity has been bestowed on Mordecai for this?" the king demanded, his voice sharp in the stillness. The attending servants exchanged nervous glances. The answer, when it came, was a quiet, damning admission. Nothing had been done for him. The act of saving the king's life had been recorded for posterity, but the man himself had been forgotten. His loyalty left to gather dust in the archives while he remained at his lowly post, unrewarded and overlooked. The injustice of it burned in the king's chest, a stark contrast to the lavish honors he had so recently heaped upon Haman. The symmetry was unsettling. On one hand, a man who had saved his life received nothing. On the other, a man he had promoted to the highest station was currently the sole guest of the queen, basking in unearned privilege. The disparate threads of the night, Esther's mystery, his own sleeplessness, this uncovered act of neglected loyalty, began to weave together into a pattern whose full design he could not yet see, but whose tension he could feel pulling at the fabric of his court. A resolve, firm and decisive, crystallized within him. The neglect would be rectified immediately. The man who had demonstrated such steadfast loyalty would be honored, and honored in a way that was as public and undeniable as the decree of death that currently hung over his people. The king's sleepless night had borne fruit. A long-delayed justice was about to be served. Chapter 16. Mordecai's honor. The first light of dawn had not yet grayed the sky when the king's summons came for Haman. The Agagite, who had spent the night in the grim satisfaction of watching his gallows rise, hastened to the palace with a heart swollen with anticipation. He believed the early call was to grant his request, to secure the royal permission to hang Mordecai, and thus finally purge the world of his insult. He entered the outer court with a confident stride, his mind already composing the words he would use, picturing the king's easy ascent. The air in the citadel was cool and still, holding its breath for the drama about to unfold. King Ahasuerus was already seated, his face showing the traces of a sleepless night, but his eyes sharp and clear with purpose. He did not wait for Haman to speak. As soon as his most honored official stood before him, the king posed a single, deceptively simple question. What should be done for the man the king delights to honor? The question hung in the quiet chamber, a loaded trap disguised as a consultation. Haman's heart gave a great, triumphant leap. In the arrogance that had become his prison, he did not for a moment consider that the king could be speaking of anyone else. Who else had the king been feasting with but him? Who else had been singled out for such exclusive favor? The question was a mirror, and in it Haman saw only the reflection of his own magnificent self. A grand theatrical vision of his own glorification unfolded instantly in his mind, a fantasy so vivid it felt like prophecy. He began to speak, his voice rich with self-congratulatory fervor. He described a procession of unparalleled honor, a spectacle designed to broadcast the king's favor to every corner of the city. Let royal robes be brought, he declared, the very ones the king himself had worn, imbued with the scent and authority of the throne. Let a horse be brought, one from the king's own royal stables, its bridle and trappings bearing the imperial crest. Then let one of the most noble princes in the king's court be commanded to lead this man, this paragon of honor, through the open square of the city. Let the prince robe the man, set him upon the king's own horse, and proclaim before him, "Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor." It was a tableau of absolute supremacy, a coronation of his ego played out on the public stage of Susa. Every detail was a testament to the heights of his own ambition. The king listened, his expression inscrutable. When Haman finished, his chest puffed out with the brilliance of his own suggestion, Ahasuerus delivered his verdict with a swift, devastating finality. "Hurry!" the king commanded, his voice cutting through the Agagite's reverie. "Take the robes and the horse, as you have said, and do so to Mordecai, the Jew who sits at the king's gate. Leave out nothing that you have spoken." The word struck Haman like a physical blow, a thunderclap of humiliation that shattered the crystal palace of his pride. Mordecai! The name was a curse, a poison. The glorious procession he had just painted, the robes, the horse, the proclamation. It was all for the silent, defiant Jew at the gate. The honor he had crafted for himself was to be his own public crucifixion. A cold dread, colder than the grave, seeped into his bones. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The king's favor was not a shield. It was a sword being wielded by an unseen hand, and it was turning against him. The early summons was not for his triumph, but for his degradation. A terrible, dawning fear gripped him. What did the king know? What did Esther's mystery have to do with this? But the law of the Medes and Persians was unyielding, and the king's command was absolute. There was no appeal. Haman, his face a mask of ashen horror, was forced to act as the chief architect of his own humiliation. He gathered the royal robes, their fine linen feeling like a shroud in his hands. He went to the royal stables and selected the most majestic steed, its proud head a mockery of his own impending disgrace. He then had to walk, a condemned man, to the king's gate, where Mordecai still sat in his quiet vigil. The public square began to fill as the news of the strange procession spread. People gathered, their murmurs a rising wave of confusion and fascination. Haman, the second most powerful man in the empire, approached the lowly official. He did not speak. His hands trembled as he held out the king's own robes, helping to dress the man he had vowed to hang. He assisted Mordecai onto the king's horse, the act of submission so profound it felt like a violation of his very soul. Then, taking the bridle, he began to lead the horse through the streets of the city, his face burning with a shame so intense it was a physical fire. He was forced to shout the words he had crafted for his own glory, now the herald of his enemy's triumph. "Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor." Mordecai, seated high upon the royal steed, clad in the king's own garments, was a picture of serene dignity. He did not gloat. He did not smile. He simply accepted the honor with the same quiet resolve with which he had endured insult. The contrast between the two men was stark. One, elevated by a quiet loyalty he had never sought, the other, crushed by a pride he could not contain. As the procession wound its way through the dusty, crowded streets, Haman's mind raced, a frantic animal in a trap. This was no random act of justice. This was a signal, a shift in the wind of royal favor that smelled of Esther's influence and a coming storm. The gallows he had built for Mordecai now loomed in his mind not as an instrument of vengeance, but as a portent of his own doom. The honor he was forced to bestow was the first unmistakable crack in the foundation of his power, and he was terrified of the collapse to come. Chapter 17. The Second Banquet. The air in the queen's banquet hall was thick with the scent of impending revelation, a perfume more potent than the spiced wine and roasted meats that adorned the low tables. Golden light from hanging lamps pooled on the polished marble floor, catching the glint of silver platters and the deep jeweled tones of the tapestries that draped the walls. Esther stood at the center of this carefully constructed world, a queen in her full regalia, her heart a tightly coiled spring beneath the calm surface of her demeanor. The 3 days of fasting, the desperate prayers, the terrifying approach to the king, the first banquet's calculated suspense, all of it had been a prelude to this single defining moment. The stage was set, the players were assembled, and the weight of a people's destiny rested upon her shoulders. King Ahasuerus reclined upon his cushions, his expression a mixture of indulgent curiosity and genuine affection. The mystery of Esther's request had simmered in his mind since the previous evening, a pleasant intrigue that had even invaded his sleep. He looked upon his queen with a fondness deepened by her courage, eager to finally unlock the secret she guarded so closely. Beside him, Haman occupied his place of honor, but the smug satisfaction that had characterized him the night before was now a frayed and brittle thing. The memory of his humiliating procession through the city with Mordecai sat like a cold stone in his gut. The public honor bestowed upon his enemy had been a devastating blow to his pride, a crack in the edifice of his confidence. He forced a smile, he drank the wine, but his eyes darted nervously, searching Esther's composed face for a clue, his mind racing with a dread he could not yet name. The gallows standing in his courtyard felt less like a promise of vengeance and more like a grim omen. Esther moved through the ritual of the meal with a hypnotic grace. Her hands were steady as she poured the wine, her voice a soft, melodic counterpoint to the tense silence that stretched between the king's curiosity and Haman's anxiety. She served them the choicest delicacies, tender lamb glazed with pomegranate, figs stuffed with almonds, flatbreads still warm from the oven. Every gesture was measured, every smile a carefully placed piece in the intricate puzzle she was assembling. She was the perfect hostess, yet her every action was a slow, deliberate tightening of the noose around the man who had vowed to destroy her world. She could feel the weight of Mordecai's faith, the collective breath of every Jewish family in the empire, held in this suspended moment. Her own fear was a distant echo, drowned out by the roaring certainty of her purpose. She had been prepared, anointed, and placed in this position not by chance, but for this very confrontation. The faith that had been her secret sustenance was now her public armor, and she wore it with a queen's authority. The final course was cleared, the last drops of wine lingered in the golden goblets, and a profound stillness descended upon the banquet hall. The pleasant hum of the meal was gone, replaced by a silence that felt like the drawn breath before a storm. King Ahasuerus, his face softened by wine and affection, turned to his queen. His gaze was expectant, his curiosity having been stoked to a gentle flame by the delay and the intimate setting. He leaned forward, his voice warm and reassuring in the hushed space. For the third time, he posed the question that had hung between them for 2 days, the mystery that had driven her to risk her life. He asked for her petition, promising once more that it would be granted even to the half of his kingdom. The grand offer, now familiar, was no longer a formality but a genuine pledge, a key he was eager to place in her hand. Esther looked from the king's open, trusting face to the tense, watchful countenance of Haman. The moment of truth, so long in the making, had arrived. All the practiced grace, the strategic smiles, the patient waiting fell away, revealing the raw, unvarnished Pleo beneath. She drew a slow, steadying breath, feeling the collective prayers of her people lending strength to her voice. When she spoke, her words were not those of a queen issuing a demand, but of a woman pleading for her life and the lives of those she loved. Her voice, though soft, carried a clarity that pierced the stillness of the room. "If I have found favor in your sight, O king," she began, her eyes locked with his, "and if it please the king, let my life be given me at my petition, and my people at my request." The words landed with the force of a physical blow. The king's indulgent expression vanished, replaced by stunned confusion. His queen, the most protected woman in the empire, was begging for her life? The concept was so alien, so shocking, that it took a moment to register. A dark frown creased his brow as he tried to reconcile her words with the reality of her position. Esther did not let the moment falter. She pressed on, her voice gaining a desperate intensity. "For we have been sold, I and my people," she continued, the pronoun we binding her fate irrevocably to the condemned, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. She laid out the grim trifecta of the decree, making the abstract horror terrifyingly personal. Then she delivered the master stroke, the turn that shifted the accusation from a faceless edict to a personal betrayal. "If we had been sold merely as slaves, men and women, I would have held my peace," she said, her words a poignant reminder of her long-held silence, "for our affliction would not be worth troubling the king." The king was utterly bewildered, his mind reeling. "Who is he?" he demanded, his voice rising with a mix of anger and incredulity. "And where is he who has dared to do this?" His gaze swept the room as if expecting to find the culprit lurking in the shadows, his protective instincts for his queen now fully ignited, transforming his curiosity into a burning need for justice. Esther rose to her feet, her posture straight, her royal robes seeming to draw all the light in the room. She lifted her arm, her finger unerring, and pointed directly at the man seated in the place of honor. Her eyes, blazing with a fire born of truth and righteous fury, fixed upon him. "A foe and an enemy!" she declared, her voice ringing with a power that seemed to shake the very tapestries on the walls. "This wicked Haman!" The revelation exploded in the silent hall. Haman, who had been watching the exchange with a growing, paralyzing dread, felt the world drop out from beneath him. The queen's words were a death knell. The king's favor, the lavish banquets, the sense of untouchable power. It all crumbled to dust in an instant. He saw the king's face transform from confusion to a thunderous, cold rage. The benevolent monarch was gone, replaced by the absolute ruler whose will had been transgressed in the most personal way imaginable. The man he had promoted, honored, and feasted with had plotted the destruction of his own queen. The realization of Esther's Jewish identity, the understanding of Haman's genocidal plot, and the scale of the deception crashed upon the king simultaneously. In that searing moment of clarity, Haman saw the abyss opening at his feet. His downfall was not merely near, it was present, absolute, and terrifying. The golden scepter that had spared Esther's life now felt like a sword pointing directly at his heart, and he was utterly, irrevocably lost. Chapter 18. Haman's Downfall. The king's rage was a silent physical force that seemed to suck the very air from the banquet hall. It was not a hot, shouting fury, but a cold, expanding void of wrath that froze the scene in a moment of horrific clarity. The revelation hung between them, a truth so monstrous it had momentarily stunned the world into stillness. The king's eyes, fixed on Haman, were no longer those of an indulgent sovereign, but of a man confronting a profound and personal betrayal. He saw, with a devastating finality, the architect of his queen's terror seated at his own table, a viper he had warmed against his own breast. The lavish honors, the shared banquets, the trust he had placed in this man, all of it curdled into a single, corrosive understanding. Haman had not merely issued a decree. He had plotted the murder of the woman the king loved, disguising genocide as statecraft. Haman, for his part, felt the foundation of his existence crumble. The color drained from his face, leaving a sickly, ashen pallor. The fine wine he had drunk turned to acid in his stomach. The queen's pointed finger was a brand searing his soul, and the king's silent gathering storm promised an annihilation far more swift and terrible than the one he had planned for Mordecai. A desperate animal panic seized him. All his cunning, his wealth, his political influence evaporated into nothing. He was reduced to a core of pure, undiluted fear. Seeing the king rise from the table with a terrible, deliberate slowness, Haman's instincts for self-preservation overrode all dignity, all pride. He stumbled from his own couch and fell to his knees before Queen Esther, who remained standing like an avenging angel. He clutched at the cushions of her couch, his body racked with sobs, his words a tangled, incoherent plea for mercy. He begged for his life, his voice a broken thing, groveling before the very identity he had sought to erase from the earth. It was at this precise moment, as Haman collapsed in a supplicating heap at the queen's feet, that King Ahasuerus, his fury seeking an outlet, stormed back into the hall from the garden where he had gone to master his anger. The scene that met his eyes was the final, unforgivable transgression. His mind, already poisoned against Haman, interpreted the sight in the worst possible light. He saw his chief minister, the man who had just been exposed as a plotter of the queen's death, now prostrate upon the very couch where she reclined, his hands grasping at her robes. In the king's eyes, it was not a plea for mercy. It was an assault, a final brazen attempt to violate the queen in the king's own presence. A roar of outrage escaped his lips. Will he even assault the queen right here in front of me in the palace? The accusation was a death sentence. The king's attendants, who had been standing as still as statues, now moved with swift, grim purpose. One of them, Harbona, a eunuch in the king's service, saw the final piece of the puzzle and spoke it into existence. "Look," Harbona said, his voice cutting through the tension. "The gallows, 50 cubits high, which Haman made for Mordecai, who spoke good on the king's behalf, is standing at Haman's house." The statement was perfectly timed, connecting Haman's personal vendetta directly to his public treachery. The gallows, built from the timber of Haman's pride, was no longer just for Mordecai. It was a monument to the Agagite's own wickedness, a ready-made instrument of his doom. The king's command was instantaneous and absolute. "Hang him on it." The words were devoid of all emotion, the simple, final logic of retributive justice. There were no further questions, no trials. The evidence was incontrovertible, the crime unforgivable. The guards seized Haman, who was now limp and unresisting, the last vestiges of his spirit broken. They dragged him from the queen's presence, through the silent watching palace, and out into the growing dawn. The man who had risen to the second highest position in the known world was hauled through the streets he had recently paraded Mordecai through, a grim reversal of fortune. They arrived at his own house, where the towering gallows stood, a stark, ugly silhouette against the brightening sky. The structure he had built with such vile anticipation now received its intended victim. The deed was carried out with swift, impersonal efficiency. Haman was hanged on the very gallows he had prepared for Mordecai. The justice was poetic, a perfect and brutal circle. The instrument of his hatred became the means of his execution, a public demonstration that the schemes of the wicked often ensnare their own feet. As the sun rose fully over Susa, it illuminated the body of the fallen vizier, a stark warning to the city and the empire. The immediate threat was eradicated. The king's wrath, once a tool in Haman's hand, had turned and consumed him. In the quiet of the palace, Esther allowed herself a first shuddering breath of relief. The tide, which had seemed an inexorable wave of destruction, had begun to turn. Her bravery, her faith, and her strategic courage had, against all odds, felled a giant. The first and most dangerous battle was won. Chapter 19. A New Decree. The silence that settled over the palace in the wake of Haman's execution was not one of peace, but of a terrible, unresolved tension. The architect of the genocide was gone, swinging from the gallows of his own making, but the edict he had authored remained, an unchangeable law of the Medes and Persians that hung over the Jewish people like a drawn sword. The king's fury had found its immediate target in Haman, but the bureaucratic machinery of death was still in motion, its gears oiled by royal decree, and its date, the 13th of Adar, fixed in the stars. Esther, standing in her banquet hall amidst the remnants of the feast, felt no triumph, only the chilling weight of this unfinished business. The enemy was dead, but his poison still flowed through the veins of the empire. King Ahasuerus, his anger having cooled into a grim satisfaction at the swiftness of his justice, turned his attention back to his queen. The revelation of her identity had not diminished her in his eyes. If anything, it had magnified her. He saw not just a beautiful woman, but a figure of profound courage and loyalty, who had risked everything for her people. In a gesture that spoke of both restitution and deepening regard, he bestowed upon Esther the house of Haman. The vast estates, the accumulated treasures, the very seat of the enemy's power were now hers. It was a symbolic transfer, a king's attempt to erase the shadow Haman had cast by giving his substance to the one he had wronged. But Esther knew that property was no substitute for life. The gift was grand, but it was meaningless so long as the death sentence over her people remained in force. The king's favor was now firmly with her, a palpable force in the room. Mordecai, the man whose loyalty was now a matter of public record, was summoned to the queen's presence. The sight of her cousin, the man who had been both father and protector, standing before her in the palace where she had lived a double life, was a powerful affirmation. The king, recognizing the quality of the man he had so long overlooked, took the signet ring he had once given to Haman, the ring that had sealed the decree of destruction, and presented it to Mordecai. The instrument of genocide was now in the hands of its intended victim. Esther had appointed Mordecai over the house of Haman, and the king had effectively placed the vizier's authority upon his shoulders. The shift in power was seismic, a complete inversion of the previous order. Yet the central, terrifying problem remained. Esther, fortified by this new authority and the king's clear affection, approached him once more. She did not come as a supplicant this time, but as a partner in governance, her voice steady, though her heart still ached with the urgency of the crisis. She fell at his feet, a gesture of humility that now carried the weight of her office, and with tears streaking her face, she implored him. She begged him to put away the mischief Haman had devised and the scheme he had conceived against the Jews. She asked him to revoke the letters, the official dispatches that even now were being implemented across the empire, preparing the ground for the massacre. The king's face, which had been softened with concern for her, now showed a flicker of profound helplessness. He spread his hands in a gesture of immutable law. He reminded her of the foundational principle of his reign, the very bedrock of Persian power. A decree written in the king's name and sealed with the king's signet ring could not be revoked. It was a law of the Medes and Persians, as fixed as the course of the sun. To change it would be to unravel the fabric of the empire itself, to introduce a chaos that would undermine every royal command ever given. The horror on Esther's face reflected his own frustration. He had the will to save her people, but his own power was bound by the very system that gave him authority. But in that moment of legal impasse, a solution began to form, born from the intersection of Persian law and the new dynamic of power in the court. Since the first decree could not be annulled, its effect could be countered. The king looked from Esther's determined face to Mordecai's resolute one. He saw in them not just victims, but instruments of a new order. "Now you write," the king said to Esther and Mordecai, his voice gaining a new resolve, "concerning the Jews, as seems good to you, in the king's name, and seal it with the king's signet ring." He was granting them the full weight of his royal authority to craft a response. They could not erase the old law, but they could write a new one to stand beside it. They were being given the power to author a decree of their own, a legal counterweight that could, if not cancel the first, at least arm its intended victims against its consequences. The king had found a way to bend the unbreakable law, not by breaking it, but by overwhelming it with a new expression of his will. The fate of the Jews was now in the hands of the queen and the cousin she trusted above all others, and they would right their people a fighting chance. The king's words were not a solution, but a weapon placed in their hands, a chance to write a new reality over the grim text of the old. The moment the royal permission was given, a new and urgent energy crackled through the queen's chambers. The paralysis of fear was replaced by the fierce momentum of action. Mordecai, the king's signet ring heavy and cold on his finger, did not pause for celebration or rest. The same man who had sat in silent vigil at the king's gate now moved with the swift, decisive authority of the king's chief minister. Scribes were summoned immediately, their faces pale and attentive as they arrayed themselves with styly ink and fresh scrolls of fine parchment. The air, which had so recently been thick with the scent of fear and betrayal, now hummed with the sound of purposeful scratching, the physical manifestation of a people's hope being etched into law. Mordecai dictated the new decree, his voice steady and clear, each word chosen with the precision of a master strategist and the heart of a son of Israel. He wrote in the name of King Ahasuerus, using the full weight of the royal authority now vested in him, and sealed the documents with the king's own signet ring, making them as irrevocable as the death warrant they were designed to counter. The decree did not attempt the legal impossibility of revoking Haman's edict. Instead, it acknowledged its existence and then systematically dismantled its power. It granted the Jews in every city the right to assemble and defend their lives. It gave them the authority to destroy, kill, and annihilate any armed force of any nationality or province that might attack them, and to plunder the property of their enemies. The language mirrored Haman's own vicious decree, but turned its violence from an instrument of oppression into a tool of liberation. It was a license to fight back, a royal sanction for a people under sentence of death to meet their attackers with organized, legally backed force. The decree was written in the script of every province and the language of every people, from the sun-baked plains of India to the lush banks of the Nile. As the scribes finished their work, the scrolls were gathered and handed to couriers mounted on the king's own swift horses, creatures bred for speed and endurance from the royal stud. These riders, who days before had been carrying messages of doom, now became heralds of deliverance. They raced from the citadel of Susa, their departure a blur of dust and determination, fanning out across the empire's vast network of royal roads. They carried the new law to every satrap, governor, and noble, its message clear. The Jews were no longer passive victims waiting for the sword to fall. They were a people under the king's protection, armed with his authority to resist. The news of the second decree spread through the Jewish communities of the empire like a life-giving rain after a long drought. In Susa, where the terror had been most acute, the change was palpable. The wailing from the Jewish quarter did not cease, but its tone transformed from one of despair to one of fierce preparation. The sackcloth and ashes were put away, replaced by the grim tools of war. Swords were sharpened, spears were fitted with new points, and bows were restrung. Fathers who had taught their sons the Torah now taught them how to hold a shield. Mothers who had sung laments now prepared poultices and stored food. The paralyzing fear that had gripped them was forged into a steely resolve. In synagogues and homes, prayers were no longer just pleas for mercy, but petitions for strength and for the courage to face the coming battle. The name of Esther was on every lip, spoken not as a hidden secret, but as a public talisman of courage. The story of her audacity, her fasting, her unsummoned approach, and her stunning revelation in the banquet hall passed from person to person, growing in power with each telling. She was no longer just their queen. She was their savior, a modern-day judge who had stepped from the shadows to champion her people. Her leadership, born in secrecy and tested in the fire of the throne room, gave them a collective heart. They saw in her the embodiment of their own hidden strength, proof that their God had not abandoned them. The decree from Mordecai gave them the legal right to fight, but the courage of Esther gave them the will. As the appointed day of the 13th of Adar drew nearer, a grim and hopeful anticipation settled over the Jewish people. They were still outnumbered, still facing a hostile world, but they were no longer alone, and they were no longer afraid. They had been given a sword and a shield, and the name of a queen to fight for. Chapter 20. The Day of Battle. Dawn on the 13th of Adar did not arrive with a gentle light, but with the cold gray clarity of drawn steel. Across the sprawling empire of Persia, from the fortified cities of the north to the desert outposts of the south, the air grew taut with an anticipation that was part terror, part grim resolve. The day that had been marked for a year on the official calendars, the day of sanctioned slaughter, had finally come. But the world had turned since the first decree was issued. The intended victims were no longer cowering in the shadows, waiting for the axe to fall. They stood ready, their hearts fortified by a new law and the fierce courage of a queen who had risked everything to arm them. In city squares and walled towns, Jewish men gathered, their faces set like flint, their hands gripping weapons that felt both foreign and familiar. They were farmers and merchants, scribes and shepherds, transformed by necessity into a citizen army, their unity their greatest strength. In the capital of Susa, the tension was a physical presence, thick enough to taste. Mordecai, now clothed in the royal robes of the vizier, moved through the Jewish quarters with an authority that was both commanding and deeply personal. He was no longer the silent watcher at the gate, but the orchestrator of their defense, his every directive carrying the weight of the king's own signet ring. He had spent the preceding days coordinating their efforts, dispatching messages to community leaders, and ensuring that the king's officials in the city, now under his command, were positioned to support the Jewish cause. His influence, so long a hidden current, was now a visible tide, ensuring that the royal support promised in the decree was not a mere parchment promise, but a tangible force. Persian soldiers, acting on the king's orders, stood watch at key points, their presence a stark warning to any who might have thought to exploit the chaos for personal vendetta or plunder. The battle lines, both legal and physical, had been clearly drawn. As the sun climbed higher, the enemies of the Jews, who had spent a year gloating over their impending spoils, stirred from their homes. They were a motley assembly, neighbors nursing ancient grudges, opportunists lured by the promise of plunder, and officials who had aligned themselves with Haman's vanished faction. They came armed, expecting to find a panicked, disorganized people easy to overwhelm. What they found instead was a wall of determined resistance. In the narrow streets of the Jewish quarter, the fighting was fierce and intimate. The clash of iron echoed off the sun-baked mud-brick walls, and the air filled with the shouts of combat and the sharp cries of the wounded. But the Jews fought with a desperate unity and a strategic cohesion that their attackers lacked. They defended their homes and their families not as scattered individuals, but as a single body, their movements guided by the preparations Mordecai had helped to coordinate. The royal support proved decisive. In Susa, where the conflict was most concentrated, the king's forces intervened at critical moments, breaking up larger mobs and preventing the violence from spiraling into a citywide pogrom. The sight of the imperial guard standing with the Jews shattered the morale of their adversaries. The promise of easy plunder vanished, replaced by the cold reality of fighting a prepared and legally sanctioned foe. The attackers, who had relied on the element of surprise and official sanction, found themselves on the wrong side of a new royal decree and the full weight of the state's power. Their assault faltered, then broke. What had been intended as a massacre became a rout. The Jews, empowered by their right to defend themselves and aided by the visible backing of the crown, pressed their advantage. They struck down those who rose against them, and a great fear fell upon all the peoples of the empire who witnessed their strength. By the time the sun began its descent, painting the sky in hues of blood and gold, the outcome was clear. In Susa and in provinces throughout the realm, the enemies of the Jews had been defeated. The streets, which had rung with the noise of battle, grew quiet, save for the sounds of tending to the wounded and the subdued murmur of a people realizing they had survived. The terrible day had arrived, but its promised destruction had been turned back upon itself. The sword that had been poised at their throats for a year had been seized from the hands of their enemies and used to carve out their deliverance. The Jews had not merely survived, they had prevailed. The long night of terror was over, and the silence that followed was not the silence of the grave, but the profound, echoing quiet of a battle won and a people, against all odds, saved. Chapter 21, Celebration and Purim. The silence that followed the battle was not the hollow quiet of a graveyard, but the deep, resonant stillness of a storm that has passed, leaving a world washed clean and trembling with life. In the Jewish quarters of Susa, and in 100 other cities across the empire, the reality of their deliverance settled upon the people not as a shout, but as a slow, dawning warmth. The weapons, still smeared with the grime of combat, were laid down. The barricades were dismantled. Fathers embraced sons they had taught to fight, their tears now of relief and awe. Mothers held their children close, the frantic pounding of their hearts finally slowing to a steady, grateful rhythm. The shadow of the 13th of Adar, which had stretched over them for an entire year, had not consumed them. They had walked through it and emerged, scarred but unbroken, into the light. This was not a deliverance that could be met with mere silence. The fear and mourning that had characterized their lives for months now demanded a release, a transformation into their absolute opposites. As if by a single unspoken command, the atmosphere shifted. The grim tools of war were exchanged for the joyful instruments of feast. From houses that had been fortresses, the sounds of celebration began to spill into the streets. The scent of roasting meat replaced the acrid smell of fear, and the air, so recently thick with tension, grew sweet with the aroma of baking bread and spiced wine. Laughter, a sound that had been a stranger for too long, rang out, tentative at first, then growing in confidence and volume. It was a celebration born from the very marrow of their survival, a visceral, collective exhalation of a breath held for a year. But this was more than just relief. It was a conscious, deliberate act of remembrance. The people understood that their salvation was not a random stroke of luck, but the culmination of a chain of events so improbable it could only be divine. Mordecai, now firmly established as the power behind the throne, recognized the profound need to institutionalize this memory, to etch the story of their deliverance into the permanent calendar of their lives. He, with Queen Esther's full authority, sent letters to all the Jews in the 127 provinces of the empire, instructing them to establish these days as a perpetual festival. He named it Purim, after the purah of the lot that Haman had cast to determine the date of their destruction. The name itself was a declaration of victory. The symbol of their intended doom was now the title of their celebration, a permanent mockery of the enemy's failed schemes. The festival was to be a time of feasting and gladness, a sending of portions of food to one another and gifts to the poor. These customs were carefully designed to reinforce the very bonds that had saved them. The feasting celebrated life itself. The sharing of food strengthened community. The gifts to the poor ensured that no one was excluded from the joy, weaving a tapestry of mutual care that stood in stark contrast to Haman's ideology of hatred and exclusion. It was a celebration rooted not in military triumph, but in the quieter, more profound victories of courage, faith, and solidarity. The story of Esther, her hidden identity, her terrifying risk, her stunning revelation, was to be told and retold each year, ensuring that the name of the quiet orphan who became a savior queen would never be forgotten. In the flickering light of the feast, as families gathered and raised their cups, they did not just celebrate their survival. They honored the providence that had worked through a woman's courage to turn a decree of death into a testament of life. The festival of Purim was born, a perpetual promise that even in the darkest times, deliverance could arise from the most unexpected of places. Chapter 22, Esther's Legacy. In the years that followed the thunderous clash of the 13th of Adar and the joyous, defiant birth of Purim, a deep and abiding peace settled over the Jewish diaspora, like a gentle, protective mantle. The story of their deliverance, once a frantic, whispered hope, became a foundational epic, told and retold in the firelight of countless homes. And at the heart of this story, forever etched in the memory of her people, was Esther. She remained queen of Persia, her position no longer a precarious secret, but a throne of profound influence, yet in the annals of her people, she was remembered not for her crown, but for her courage. She became their unsung hero, a woman whose name, Hadassah, meaning myrtle, came to symbolize a resilience that was both beautiful and enduring, able to flourish even in the shadow of exile. Her faith, once a carefully guarded flame in the dark of the palace night, was now the steady, central fire of her life. The terrifying journey from secrecy to revelation had forged in her a trust that was unshakable. She saw the invisible hand that had guided her, not as a distant force, but as a constant presence that had prepared her, anointed her, and sustained her through the valley of the shadow of death. The crown she wore felt lighter now, not because its weight had diminished, but because she understood it as part of a divine stewardship, a role she had been chosen to fulfill for a purpose far greater than herself. Her legacy was not written in the royal decrees she helped author, but in the quiet, steadfast faith she embodied, a testament that true power was found not in the scepter one held, but in the God one served. Under her quiet influence and Mordecai's astute governance, the Jewish community found a security they had never known. Mordecai, the cousin who had raised an orphan, was now the king's vizier, second only to Ahasuerus himself. He was great among the Jews and popular with the multitude of his brethren, for he sought the welfare of his people and spoke peace to all their offspring. His promotion was more than a personal triumph. It was a structural safeguard. From his seat of power, he ensured that the rights granted in the second decree were upheld, that justice was administered fairly, and that the memory of Haman's hatred served as a permanent warning against any who would threaten their peace. The Jewish people, once a vulnerable minority, were now a respected and protected community within the empire, their position secured by the two figures who had risen from their midst to the very pinnacle of Persian power. Esther's story, recounted each year during the raucous, joyful celebration of Purim, became a wellspring of inspiration for generations. Parents would tell their daughters of the queen who used her beauty and her voice not for vanity, but for salvation. They would speak of her strategic patience, her reliance on prayer and fasting, and her ultimate breathtaking gamble that rewove the fabric of their destiny. Young men and women learned from her that courage was not the absence of fear, but the will to act in spite of it. They learned that divine purpose could be hidden in the most ordinary of lives, waiting for the moment when faith would demand that it step into the light. Her legacy was a living one, a perpetual lesson that no one is insignificant, and that each person, regardless of their station or their secrets, has the potential to be an instrument of deliverance for such a time as this. In the scroll of Esther, read aloud amidst the noise of gregors and feasting, her voice echoed through the centuries, a quiet, steady reminder that even in a foreign palace, under a foreign crown, a child of promise could change the world.